The cowboy came home to an Apache woman with no clothes and no reason left to keep living. Born and raised on a small farm in the outskirts of Arizona, he had known no other life than that of hard work and the blistering heat of the desert. He learned early how to tame the wild horses and how to fix fences when they broke. He knew the desert like the back of his hand. It was a place that could take everything from you, but it could also give you everything. In it, John found his solace, but his peace was broken when war came. The Civil War had torn the country apart, and like so many young men, John had been swept up into the chaos. He fought for the Union, driven by a sense of duty, even if he didn't fully understand it at the time. He was just a man, a farmer with a rifle, thrust into battles that seemed endless. The faces of those he lost and the horrors of war became etched into his memory. Every battle, every skirmish, every death added another weight to his heart. By the end, he was a man who had seen too much, a man who had no place in the world. Before he left for war, he had made a promise to Talia, an Apache woman he had met years before, to return. Talia had been his everything. Their love had been unexpected but powerful. She was fierce, independent, and strong in ways that John couldn't fully understand. She had come from a world so different from his own, yet somehow they had found a connection, one that neither of them had ever anticipated. Talia was unlike any woman John had known. Her eyes held a quiet wisdom, a depth that he had never seen in the women from his own world. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words always carried meaning. Her presence calmed him, and when she smiled, it was as though the entire desert softened. John knew that he was lucky to have found her. They had built a small life together in the midst of the desert's harshness. They had built a home that was simple but filled with warmth. It was a life that John had never imagined he would have. But when the call to war came, he had left, just as so many others had done. Years passed, and John found himself standing at the edge of his old life, staring into a future that seemed uncertain. His body bore the scars of war, his heart weighed down by all he had seen. The war had taken so much from him, but it had also left him with a sense of emptiness that he couldn't shake. The land that had once felt like a place of comfort now felt foreign to him. He no longer knew who he was or what he was supposed to be. The man who had left for war had become someone he didn't recognize. And now, after all these years, John was returning home. The ride back to his ranch was long and slow. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the endless desert. It was a beauty that used to bring him peace, but now it only served as a reminder of what he had lost. He hadn't written to Talia during the years he had been away. He had thought of her often, but the war had consumed him, and the guilt of his abandonment had kept him from reaching out. He had thought she would understand, but now, as he neared their old home, he feared that it was too late. John had made his way back to the ranch with the hope that somehow things could go back to the way they were, that he could pick up where he had left off, that Talia would forgive him for leaving, and that they could rebuild their life together. But deep down, he knew that it was more complicated than that. The years they had spent apart were not simply going to vanish. Time had a way of changing people, and he had no idea what kind of person Talia had become in his absence. As he approached the ranch, the familiar sight of the dusty roads and the worn-down house made his heart ache. The house stood there, unchanged, but there was something about it that felt different now. The porch, where they had spent countless evenings talking and laughing, seemed emptier. The fields that they had once worked together now lay quiet and still. It was as though the life they had once shared had faded with the wind. John's heart raced as he dismounted his horse. His boots hit the dry earth with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the silence around him. He walked toward the house slowly, unsure of what he would find. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and the musty smell of the old wood filled his senses. The house was as he remembered it, dusty and dim, with the furniture left as it had been the last time he saw it. But it was empty. There was no sign of Talia. The silence was deafening. John's breath caught in his chest as he stepped further into the house, his footsteps stirring up the dust on the wooden floor. The kitchen was cold. The fire pit was unused, and the iron stove was black with neglect. His gaze moved over the room, but there was nothing that could tell him where Talia had gone. The letter he found was the only clue. It was old and torn at the edges, the ink smeared by time. John's hands trembled as he unfolded it. It was written in Talia's delicate handwriting, though the words were nearly illegible. He could make out a few phrases, but the rest was smudged beyond recognition. It didn't make sense. Why had she left? Why had she not waited for him? He sat down on the worn chair, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The war had taken so much from him, and now it seemed to have taken Talia too. The guilt that had plagued him for years now threatened to crush him. He had promised her that he would return. He had promised her that they would have a future together. But in the end, he had broken that promise. As he sat there, staring at the empty house, John wondered if he had waited too long. Had he lost Talia forever? Had she found a way to move on while he was trapped in a war that he could never fully escape? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. The house that once felt like home now felt like a tomb, a place of lost dreams and broken promises. The only sound was the whisper of the wind outside, the desert stretching on in every direction, just as empty and barren as John's heart felt. He had come home, but he wasn't sure if there was anything left to return to. John Carter sat in the stillness of the house, the words of the letter echoing in his mind, but they brought him no clarity. There was no sign of Talia. The house, once full of warmth and life, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The air, heavy with dust and silence, seemed to press in on him from every side. He stood up from the chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and moved through the house, his hands brushing against the worn furniture, the memories of a life he had once known. The kitchen was untouched, the cooking utensils still hanging on the wall, but there was no sign of life. The hearth was cold, and the fire pit had not seen use in what felt like a lifetime. The wooden floor beneath his boots seemed to have absorbed the years of neglect. The grain of the wood faded from years of wear. Everything was as it had been when he left, but everything was different now. He stepped outside, the dry desert air hitting him like a slap. The vast emptiness of the land stretched out before him, an endless horizon of dust and stone. It felt like a cruel joke, a place so familiar yet so foreign. The landscape that had once been a source of comfort now seemed to mock him, reminding him of all the time that had passed, all the things he had missed. He had left this place for war, thinking it would be temporary, that he would come back to Talia, to the life they had built together. But now it felt like that life had slipped away, like sand through his fingers. John stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the empty fields. The land seemed to echo with the memories of their hard work together, the sweat on their brows as they worked the land, the laughter that had filled the air during the long evenings. He could almost hear her voice, soft and steady, as she had told him stories of her people, of the Apache way of life. She had taught him things he never thought he would learn. He had fallen in love with her in a way that felt as natural as breathing, and he had promised her he would always return. But now that promise felt hollow. Where was she? What had happened in the years he had been gone? His mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. He had no idea where she could be or why she had left. The letter was the only clue, and even that was barely legible. Talia was an intelligent woman, strong and capable. She wouldn't have just vanished without a trace. There had to be a reason, something he had missed. But what? John had been away for far too long. The war had consumed him in a way he had never expected. He had gone into it thinking it was just something he had to do, that it was the right thing to do. But now, looking at the wreckage of his life, he wondered if it had been worth it. What had he truly gained? The world had changed, and so had he. His heart, once full of hope and love, now felt like an empty shell, a hollow version of the man he used to be. As the sun began to set, the desert landscape around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching long across the ground. The heat of the day faded, and a cool breeze began to stir the dust at his feet. John felt a deep, gnawing emptiness inside of him. He had no answers, no way of knowing where to go or what to do next. He had come back to a place that no longer felt like home, and he wasn't sure if it ever could again. Talia had been his everything. She had given him a sense of purpose, of belonging. She had been his anchor when everything else felt uncertain. And now, without her, he felt lost, adrift in a world that no longer made sense. He had spent years fighting in a war that had stolen pieces of him, and now it felt like he was fighting against the weight of his own guilt. Guilt for leaving her behind, guilt for not being there when she needed him. He had been so focused on surviving the war that he had lost sight of everything else. He had failed her. He thought about the life they had shared before he left. The small moments, the quiet evenings by the fire, the times they would sit together and talk, their plans for the future. Talia had always been the stronger of the two of them, guiding him through the hardships of life with a steady hand. She had taught him patience, perseverance, and strength. She had shown him a world that was different from his own, a world that was shaped by love and community. She had been his equal in every way, and now she was gone, or at least she wasn't here. John couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to her, something that had driven her to leave. But what? He had no way of knowing. He had no one to ask. The land was silent, the house empty. The only thing left was the letter, and even that was a puzzle he couldn't solve. The night began to settle over the desert, and the stars twinkled overhead like 1,000 eyes watching him. John's mind was racing, but he felt a strange calm wash over him. The stillness of the night seemed to mirror the emptiness he felt inside. He needed to find Talia. He had to know what had happened to her to understand why she had disappeared. Without another thought, he turned and walked toward the barn where the horses were kept. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stay here, stuck in the past, wondering what might have been. He had to find her. And maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. As he saddled up his horse, the old, familiar routine felt oddly comforting. The sound of the saddle creaking, the feel of the reins in his hands. These small, everyday actions gave him a sense of purpose, something to hold onto in the midst of the confusion. The horse snorted and stamped its feet, eager to get moving. John mounted the horse, his heart pounding with anticipation. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he had to go somewhere, anywhere, to find the answers he so desperately needed. The night air was cool against his skin as he rode out into the desert, the stars guiding his way. The land stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but it also held a strange kind of beauty. It was a place that could both break you and heal you, a place that could offer both solace and torment. John didn't know what he would find out there, but he knew he had to try. He had to find Talia to make amends, to rebuild what they had lost. He couldn't just give up. He wouldn't. And so, as the desert stretched endlessly before him, John Carter rode into the night, hoping that the path ahead would lead him to the answers he sought, and to the woman he had left behind. The night stretched on as John rode through the desert, the sound of his horse's hooves pounding softly against the dry earth. The cool air of the night was a welcome relief from the burning heat of the day, and it gave him a moment of clarity to think. The endless desert around him seemed both vast and confining, a reminder of how small he felt in this huge, unforgiving world. He had left Talia behind once, and now he was determined to find her, to fix the things he had broken. As the stars shimmered above him, John's thoughts turned to Talia. He remembered the first time he had met her. It had been a chance encounter at a local trading post. He had been just a young man then, fresh out of his teenage years, still eager to prove himself. Talia had been standing near a group of traders, watching the exchange with a quiet grace that caught his attention. Her eyes, dark and steady, had met his with an intensity he hadn't expected. There was something about her that intrigued him, something strong yet serene. She didn't speak much, but her presence filled the space around her. It was as though she didn't need words to command attention. The memory of her smile was like a spark in the darkness, bringing warmth to his chest. She had a way of making everything feel simple. When they spoke, it wasn't about grand things or promises. They just shared small moments, simple conversations. She had taught him how to listen to the desert, how to understand its rhythms. She had explained how her people lived with the land, taking only what was needed, respecting it as a living thing. John had learned more about the world from her in those few months than he had in years of living in the world he had known before. But then the war came, and he had left. He told himself it was for the right reasons that he had to go, that it was his duty to fight for what was right. But deep down, he had known that part of him was leaving behind the life he had with Talia. He was afraid of being tied down, afraid of the future, of the responsibility that came with it. Now, years later, he regretted it. He had walked away from the one person who had made him feel like he belonged somewhere, and now she was gone. John's horse slowed to a trot as he neared the edge of a rocky outcrop. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the desert. There was something haunting about the landscape at night. The rocks seemed to form strange shapes in the dim light, and the wind carried with it the scent of the earth, dry and distant. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of his horse's movements. John stopped, allowing the horse to rest, and dismounted. He stood still for a moment, his hands resting on the reins as he gazed out over the land. For a brief moment, he let himself imagine Talia. What had happened to her in all this time? Had she been waiting for him, or had she moved on? The thought gnawed at him, a constant ache in his chest. The guilt of his abandonment seemed to grow heavier as the years passed. He had left her alone in this unforgiving land, and now she was gone without a trace. The memory of her face, the way she looked at him when he had left, haunted him. Had she been angry, heartbroken, or had she understood that he had to go? John shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts. He needed to focus on finding her, not dwelling on the past. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew that he couldn't stop searching. He couldn't go back to that empty house, that quiet, lifeless place. He had to find her. As he led the horse over a narrow path, he came to a small, dried-up creek bed. The moonlight reflected off the rocks, casting eerie shadows. It was here in this desolate place that he saw a figure in the distance. At first he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light, but as he drew closer he could make out the shape of a woman standing by the water's edge. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be Talia? He urged his horse forward, riding slowly toward the figure. As he got closer, he saw that it was indeed her. Talia stood by the creek, her long hair flowing behind her in the breeze. Her back was turned to him, and she appeared to be lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the water. "Talia," John called out, his voice rough from the dust of the desert. His heart raced in his chest as he approached her. Talia's body stiffened at the sound of his voice, and she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes met his, but there was no warmth in them. The intense connection he remembered was gone. Instead, there was a coolness, a distance, as if she were seeing a stranger. John's heart sank. The woman standing before him was not the Talia he remembered. She was different, hardened by the years, by the life she had lived without him. Her eyes, once filled with kindness and warmth, now held a quiet strength, a guardedness. The softness he had once known was gone, replaced by a sharp, almost bitter edge. "You found me," she said quietly, her voice calm but distant. John didn't know what to say. He had hoped that their reunion would be different, that maybe the years apart hadn't changed them as much as he feared. But now, seeing her in front of him, he realized how much time had passed, how much had changed. I've been looking for you," John said, his voice faltering. "I didn't know where to go, where you had gone. I didn't know." "Did you even try to find me before?" Talia interrupted, her voice sharp. "Or were you too busy with your war, with the world you left me behind for?" John flinched, her words cutting deep. He knew she was right. He had been too focused on the war, on survival. He had told himself he would come back, that he would make it up to her, but now, standing before her, he realized how empty those promises had been. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have come back sooner. I shouldn't have left you." "I never meant to hurt you." Talia didn't respond at first. She just stood there, her eyes cold and unreadable. The silence stretched on, and John felt as though the weight of the years between them was too much to bear. Finally, she spoke. "You think saying sorry will change anything? You think your words will undo the years I spent alone, trying to survive while you were off fighting a war you didn't even believe in?" John's heart tightened at her words, and he realized how little he truly understood about what she had gone through while he was gone. He had been focused on his own pain, his own guilt, but he had never considered how she must have felt during all those years. She had been alone, and he had abandoned her. "I don't know how to fix this," John said quietly, "but I'm here now. I want to try. I want to make things right." Talia's gaze softened for a moment, but then the hardness returned. She turned away, looking out at the desert. "I don't know if it's possible to fix what's been broken," she said, her voice low. "You can't just come back and expect everything to be the same. I'm not the same woman you left behind." John stood there in silence, the desert around him quiet and still. The wind carried the scent of the earth, and the weight of the past hung heavily in the air. He didn't know what to say next. All he knew was that he had found her, and now he had to find a way to heal the wounds they both carried. But as he watched Talia, standing there alone, he realized that the road ahead would not be easy. They had both been changed by the years apart, and the future they had once dreamed of seemed further away than ever. The silence between John and Talia stretched for what felt like an eternity. The soft rustling of the wind was the only sound that filled the air, sweeping across the desert like a whisper of the past. John stood there, his heart heavy with regret, unsure of what to say next. He had come looking for answers, for a way to mend the rift between them, but now that he was here, he didn't know where to begin. The woman he had once loved, The woman he had left behind was standing before him, but she felt like a stranger. Talia shifted her weight, her expression unreadable as she stared off into the distance, her long hair flowing gently in the breeze. Her posture was strong, resolute, but there was a weariness to her, a sense of having carried the weight of the world alone for far too long. John couldn't help but wonder what she had been through in the years since he had left. He had assumed that she would have waited for him, that she would have understood. But now, seeing her standing there, he realized how wrong he had been. "I never meant for any of this to happen," John finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that I had to go, that I had to fight. But I never thought about what it would mean for you. I never thought about how much I was leaving behind." Talia turned to face him, her eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, just studying him as if trying to figure out if he was the man he once was, or if he had changed beyond recognition. Her gaze held no warmth, no affection, just a coldness that made John's heart sink further. "You think that after all these years, a few words will make everything better?" she asked quietly. "You think that after all the time I spent alone, trying to survive in a world without you, that your apologies will fix things?" John flinched at the bitterness in her voice. He deserved every ounce of it. He had left her behind in a harsh, unforgiving land, without a second thought. He had been so focused on the war, on surviving, that he had failed to consider how she was surviving without him. He had broken her trust, and now it felt like there was no way to rebuild what he had destroyed. "I didn't know how to come back," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I didn't know if you'd even want me back. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I thought if I could survive the war, then I could come back and fix everything. But now I see that I've made everything worse." Talia's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. She took a step back, looking away from him once more, her gaze drifting over the desert landscape. The vast emptiness stretched out before them, a symbol of the distance that had grown between them. The years apart had created a gap that felt too wide to bridge, and John wasn't sure if he could cross it. "Do you know what it's like to wait for someone who doesn't come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To spend days, months, years wondering if they're even alive, wondering if they ever think of you. I spent so many nights alone, John. So many nights sitting here thinking you'd come walking back through that door. But you never did. And when I realized you weren't coming back, I had to learn how to survive without you. I had to learn how to live without you." John's heart broke as he listened to her words. He had no idea the pain she had gone through. He had been so focused on his own survival, on his own struggles, that he had never considered what it had been like for her. He had never considered how much he had hurt her by leaving, by disappearing from her life without a second thought. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since his return now felt unbearable. "I'm sorry, Talia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what it would be like for you. I didn't know how much I was hurting you by leaving. I should have come back sooner. I should have never left you." Talia's eyes flickered with something that John couldn't quite place. Anger, pain, maybe both. She turned away from him, walking a few steps before stopping and looking out over the desert again. "I don't know if you can fix this, John," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't know if it's possible for us to go back to what we had. You've been gone for so long, so much has changed. I've changed." John's chest tightened as he heard her words. He knew that she was right. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind, and he wasn't the same man who had walked away from her all those years ago. The war had changed him. The years of fighting, of surviving, had shaped him into someone he didn't fully recognize. He had returned to find her, but now he wasn't sure what he was returning to. "I'm not the same person I was when I left," he said softly. "I can't expect things to just go back to the way they were, but I want to try. I want to try and make things right, even if it's not the same, even if it's not perfect. I just want a chance." Talia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. John could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that still cared for him, and the part of her that had been hurt too much to ever trust him again. "I don't know if I can give you that chance, John," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I once did, but I can't deny that I still feel something that tells me I should listen to you. Something that tells me maybe it's worth trying again." John's heart leaped in his chest. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was no magic word that could erase the years of pain, of loss, of betrayal. But for the first time in a long time, John felt like he had a chance to rebuild, to make things right. He took a step toward her, slowly, cautiously, not wanting to push her too far, but needing to be close to her. Talia didn't move, but she didn't pull away either. She stood there watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. "I know it won't be easy," John said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes, Talia, if you'll give me a chance." Talia's eyes softened for a moment, but her expression remained guarded. She didn't speak, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a hint of the warmth that had once been there. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And for John, that was enough. For the first time since he had returned, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. It wasn't the ground he had once known, but it was ground nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something from the ruins of their past. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. The tension between John and Talia was palpable, and yet there was something about the air between them now that felt different. It was not the comfort of the past, but it wasn't the coldness of complete detachment either. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something new, something that could either fall apart or begin to heal. John found himself staying near the creek for a while, where Talia had been when they first reunited. Every morning he would wake early, the cool desert air filling his lungs, and he would walk to the creek, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to share a quiet moment, or perhaps to begin the slow and painful work of repairing their relationship. But Talia was never far. She was always nearby, moving through the land with a quiet grace that John remembered. She had once been everything to him, and though they both knew things had changed, some part of him still longed for the bond they once shared. Talia, for her part, seemed content with silence. She didn't rush to engage with him, but neither did she push him away. She had her own way of dealing with the world, of existing in it. She still carried the strength that had made John fall in love with her in the first place. But now it was sharper. It wasn't the same warmth he remembered. This was the strength of someone who had learned to survive, someone who had carried the weight of the world alone for far too long. Over the next few days, they began to slip into a routine. It wasn't a perfect one, but it was something. John would work the land in the mornings, fixing the fences and tending to the animals. He did so with a kind of quiet determination, as if each task, no matter how small, was a way of trying to rebuild the life he had destroyed. Talia worked alongside him sometimes, though she often kept to herself, her focus entirely on the land that had been her home long before John arrived. She had become a part of it in a way that was almost spiritual. John could see that in the way she moved, in the way she handled the plants, the animals, and the earth. There was an elegance to her, a connection that he could never fully understand, but that he respected deeply. One afternoon, John sat on the porch, wiping the sweat from his brow. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting the desert in hues of orange and purple. It was one of those quiet moments where everything seemed still, as if the world had stopped just to catch its breath. He had hoped for this, for peace, for things to return to some kind of normalcy, but normal didn't seem to exist anymore. Nothing was the same as it once was. Talia came outside, carrying a small basket of herbs she had gathered from the land. She moved with purpose, but her steps were slow, measured. When she reached the porch, she placed the basket down on the wooden table beside John. He glanced up at her, his heart catching for a brief moment. She didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, looking out over the horizon, her eyes scanning the desert as if searching for something in its vast emptiness. The air between them felt thick again, but it was different this time. It wasn't suffocating. It was a kind of tension that came from the unknown, from the possibility of something being rebuilt, even if it wasn't clear how it would happen. "How did you learn to survive out here?" John asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence between them. He had asked himself that question countless times since his return. How had Talia done it? How had she lived through the years without him? Talia turned her gaze toward him, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was a depth, a quiet wisdom that John couldn't ignore. She had always been wise beyond her years. And now more than ever he saw the strength in her that had carried her through those years alone. "You learned to live," she said simply, her voice low but steady. You learn to adapt. The land teaches you. It doesn't care about your past or your pain, it just is. You take what it gives and you give back what you can. John nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the basket of herbs. He could feel the weight of her words. They weren't just about surviving in the desert. They were about surviving life, about accepting the things that had happened, whether he wanted to or not. She had survived without him. She had made a life for herself, one that didn't depend on him. And perhaps that was the hardest truth he had to face. Talia had learned to live without him, just as he had learned to live without her. The evening passed slowly, the sky fading from deep purple to a velvety black, dotted with stars. The desert night was calm, but there was something alive in the air, something that spoke of possibilities. John knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. That was impossible. Too much time had passed and too much had changed. But he wasn't sure what they could become now. Could they find a way forward? Could they learn to trust each other again? Could they rebuild what had been lost? That night after dinner, John stayed outside a little longer. Talia had gone inside to prepare for bed, and he was left alone with his thoughts. He sat on the porch, the cool air brushing against his skin, and he looked out over the desert. The stars above seemed like tiny pinpricks in the vast darkness, and for a moment he felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But then he realized that wasn't the point. It wasn't about being significant. It was about trying, about making the effort, even when it seemed impossible. The sound of footsteps on the porch made him look up. Talia stood in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the light from inside the house. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. She simply walked over to where he was sitting and sat down beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. For a long time they didn't speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. They just sat there, side by side, looking out at the desert, watching as the world around them settled into stillness. John felt something shift in him, a quiet acceptance of the present. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need everything to be perfect. He just needed to be here now with Talia. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," John said after a long pause, his voice soft but steady. "I don't think I have a right to ask for that, but I want to try. I want to make it right, whatever that looks like." Talia looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded. "We'll see," she said quietly. "We'll see what happens." And for the first time, John felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. But it was something. It was a step forward. The night deepened around them, and they sat there together, the desert silent and vast. They didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, they were both willing to find out. Together.